Miss Marple and the Widow with Two Wills. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us tonight. These mysteries bring us together from every corner of the world, reminding us how stories can truly connect hearts across distances. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from this evening? Don't forget to subscribe, as over 80% of our listeners haven't yet, and we share new cozy mysteries every single day. Now wrap yourself in your blanket, pour a warm cup of tea, and let's begin tonight's story. April rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the usually cheerful gardens of St. Mary Mead into sodden patches of brown earth and drooping daffodils. Miss Jane Marple, peering through her sitting room window at the gray morning, reflected that there was something rather melancholy about spring rain. It seemed to wash away hope rather than nurture it. The knock at her front door came at 9, delivered by young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, whose bicycle wheels had left muddy tracks up her garden path. "Message from Mrs. Clement, miss," he panted, water dripping from his cap. "You're to come to Rosemary at your convenience. Mrs. Fielding passed away in her sleep last night." Miss Marple received this news with the composure of one who had lived long enough to know that death, like the seasons, followed its own inevitable rhythm. Mrs. Honoria Fielding, widow of the railway contractor who had built half the branch lines in the county, had been ailing for some months. Still, it was always a shock when the final summons came. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, pressing a sixpence into the boy's damp palm. "Tell Mrs. Clement I shall be along presently." Rosemary stood at the better end of the village, a solid Victorian villa built of red brick with white trim that had always reminded Miss Marple of a particularly well-dressed matron. The house suited Mrs. Fielding perfectly, prosperous, respectable, and slightly imposing. As Miss Marple approached the front gate, she noted that the brass nameplate had already been draped with black crepe, and the curtains in all the front windows had been drawn. The door was opened by Miss Alma Reeve, Mrs. Fielding's companion and housekeeper, a thin woman of indeterminate age, whose gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were red with weeping, but her manner remained as brisk and efficient as ever. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, dabbing at her nose with a black-bordered handkerchief. "How good of you to come so quickly. Mrs. Clement is in the morning room with the others." The morning room at Rosemary had always been Mrs. Fielding's particular domain, furnished with horsehair chairs and a large mahogany desk where she had conducted her considerable correspondence with various charitable organizations. Today, the room seemed to have acquired an air of solemn ceremony that had not been there during Mrs. Fielding's lifetime. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, rose as Miss Marple entered. Her usually cheerful face was appropriately grave, but Miss Marple detected a certain suppressed excitement in her manner, the kind that comes from being intimately involved in dramatic events. "Jane, dear," Mrs. Clement said, taking her hands. "Such a peaceful end. She simply didn't wake up. Dr. Haydock says her heart gave out. Not unexpected, really, at her age." Also present was Lady Bantry, magnificent even at such an early hour in a purple coat that clashed magnificently with her gray hair. She nodded to Miss Marple with the authority of one who considered herself the natural leader in all village. "Crises. Sad business," Lady Bantry pronounced, "though I must say, Honoria lived a good long life. 83, wasn't she? And never a day's real illness until this past year." Dr. Haydock, a stout man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden. He turned as Miss Marple greeted him. "Natural causes, without a doubt," he said, answering the question no one had asked but everyone was thinking. Her heart had been weakening for months. I rather think she knew the end was near. She seemed remarkably at peace these past few weeks. The Reverend Leonard Clement, a tall, thin man with prematurely gray hair, was examining the books on Mrs. Fielding's shelves with the absent-minded air of one who finds comfort in literature during times of distress. "She was a pillar of our community," he said quietly. "Her contributions to the church, to the hospital fund, to the almshouses. We shall miss her generosity greatly." It was then that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mrs. Fielding's desk, which stood in the corner by the window. The desktop was, as always, meticulously organized, but something about its arrangement struck her as odd. There was a neat stack of green legal ribbon beside the inkwell, and next to it sat a small wooden box which she knew contained red wafer seals, the kind used by solicitors to secure legal documents. What struck her as curious was that both the ribbon and the seals appeared to be lightly covered with dust, as though they had sat untouched for some considerable time. Yet Mrs. Fielding had been an active correspondent, constantly writing to various charities and organizations. Surely she would have had occasion to use such items. "The funeral arrangements," Mrs. Clement was saying, but she was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hall and voices in conversation. Miss Alma Reeve appeared in the doorway, followed by a distinguished-looking elderly gentleman carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. Peril Boyce," Miss Reeve announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Fielding's solicitor." Mr. Boyce was a man of perhaps 70, with snow-white hair and the slightly stooped shoulders of one who had spent a lifetime bent over legal documents. His manner was gravely courteous as he acknowledged the assembled company. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, setting his briefcase on a side table with careful precision. A sad occasion indeed. Mrs. Fielding was not only a valued client, but a dear friend. "I have come, as is proper, to discuss the arrangements for her will." Behind Mr. Boyce stood a younger woman, whom Miss Marple recognized as Miss Maud Trent, his junior clerk. She was perhaps 40, with sandy hair and pale blue eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles. She carried herself with the rigid posture of one determined to maintain perfect professional propriety, but Miss Marple noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. "Of course the will," said Lady Bantry, with a practical tone of one accustomed to managing such affairs. "I suppose there will be the usual bequest to the servants and charities." Mr. Boyce inclined his head gravely. Mrs. Fielding's testamentary wishes were quite clear. The will is a straightforward document, drawn up some years ago. She was most particular about her charitable bequests. Miss Marple found herself studying the little tableau, the grieving companion, the elderly solicitor with his precise manner, the nervous clerk, and the assembled friends and neighbors. There was something in the atmosphere, a tension she could not quite identify. It reminded her of the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Dr. Haydock glanced at his pocket watch. "I must be getting on," he said. "Mrs. Patterson's baby is due any day now, and with this weather—" He gathered up his medical bag and took his leave, promising to return later to sign the necessary certificates. As the others began to discuss funeral arrangements and the proper observances, Miss Marple found her gaze returning to that desk by the window. There was something about those dusty legal supplies that continued to puzzle her. In her long experience, she had learned that the smallest details often held the greatest significance. She was still pondering this when the morning's peace was shattered by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose heavy footsteps and official manner always seemed to bring with them an air of impending complications. "Routine inquiries," he announced to the room at large, though his presence suggested that perhaps Mrs. Fielding's peaceful death might not remain quite so simple after all. The April rain continued to fall against the windows of Rosemary, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair with the patient attention of one who sensed that this was only the beginning of what promised to be a most interesting affair. The morning dragged on with the peculiar slowness that accompanies such occasions, filled with hushed conversations and the careful arrangements that death demands. By noon, the rain had finally ceased, though the sky remained the color of pewter, and a thin mist clung to the hedges around Rosemary. Mr. Boyce had requested the use of Mrs. Fielding's morning room for the reading of the will, and the same group that had gathered earlier now reassembled, with the addition of Inspector Slack, who had positioned himself near the door with the air of a man who expected trouble, but hoped he was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Boyce began, adjusting his spectacles and opening his leather briefcase with ceremonial precision, "I have here the last will and testament of Mrs. Honoria Fielding, dated the 15th of March, 1938. He withdrew a thick document tied with green legal ribbon and sealed with red wax, handling it with a reverence due to such solemn instruments. Miss Maud Trent sat beside him, her notebook ready, her pale eyes fixed on the document with professional attention. "The will is quite straightforward," Mr. Boyce continued, breaking the seal with careful movements. "After the usual small bequests, to faithful servants, $50 to Miss Reeve, 25 each to the cook and housemaid, the bulk of Mrs. Fielding's estate, including this house and her investments, is left to various parish charities." A murmur of approval went around the room. Mrs. Clement smiled with satisfaction, while the Reverend Leonard nodded approvingly. Lady Bantry pronounced it exactly what one would expect of dear Honoria. "The principal beneficiaries," Mr. Boyce read, "from the document, are the St. Mary Hospital Fund, the Village Almshouses Trust, and the Church Restoration Fund. The estimated value of the estate is approximately $12,000. Miss Marple observed that Miss Reeve received this news with a composure that suggested she had been expecting it. The companion dabbed at her eyes with her black-bordered handkerchief, but showed no signs of disappointment at her modest bequest. "A generous legacy to the community," said Reverend Clement warmly. "Mrs. Fielding's charitable spirit will live on through these gifts." It was at this moment that the sound of a motor car drawing up outside interrupted the solemnity of the proceedings. Inspector Slack moved to the window and peered out through the lace curtains. "Someone's arrived," he announced unnecessarily, as the sound of car doors slamming and footsteps on the gravel drive reached everyone's ears. Miss Reeve rose quickly, smoothing her black dress. "That will be Mr. Gerald," she said. "Mrs. Fielding's nephew. He was traveling on the continent and only received word of his aunt's death yesterday evening." The door opened to admit a man of perhaps 45, tall and well-dressed in the manner of one accustomed to good tailoring and expensive clubs. Gerald Fielding had the sort of urban handsomeness that suggested a life spent largely in comfortable circumstances, though Miss Marple noted a certain sharpness about his eyes that spoke of a man who watched opportunities carefully. "My sincere apologies for the delay," he said, removing his hat and gloves with practiced elegance. "The Channel crossing was abominable, and the trains impossible. I came as quickly as I could." He accepted the condolences of the assembled company with appropriate gravity, embracing Miss Reeve with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Poor Aunt Honoria," he said, his voice properly subdued. "Though I suppose we must be thankful it was peaceful. She had not been well, I understand." "Her heart," said Dr. Haydock, who had returned for the will reading. "She went very peacefully in her sleep." Gerald nodded solemnly, then glanced toward Mr. Boyce with the expression of one who understands that business must be attended to even in times of grief. "I believe you are about to read Aunt Honoria's will," he said. "Please don't let my arrival delay the proceedings." Mr. Boyce cleared his throat. "As I was saying, the will dated March 15th, 1938, leaves the bulk of the estate to various charitable organizations." "I beg your pardon," Gerald interrupted gently, reaching into his inner coat pocket, "but I fear there may be some confusion." He withdrew an envelope somewhat creased from travel and placed it on the desk beside Mr. Boyce's document. "I have here what I believe to be a more recent will," he said, his tone apologetic but firm. "It was sent to me last month by Aunt Honoria, with a letter explaining that she had reconsidered her testamentary arrangements." A profound silence fell over the room. "Another will?" Mr. Boyce said faintly. I'm afraid so. Gerald's manner remained respectfully apologetic. Aunt Noria wrote to me explaining that she had decided family should come first after all. She felt that while charity was admirable, blood was thicker than water. Miss Marple watched as Gerald opened the envelope and withdrew a document that appeared at first glance remarkably similar to the one Mr. Boyce had just read. It was tied with green legal ribbon and sealed with red wax, and bore what appeared to be Mrs. Fielding's bold signature. This will is dated April 3rd, 1941, Gerald said, handing the document to Mr. Boyce. Just last month. It leaves the entire estate to me as her only surviving relative. The silence that followed this announcement was broken only by the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of someone in the kitchen preparing tea. Miss Maud Trent had gone very pale, while Miss Reeve appeared to have been struck, speechless. Mr. Boyce examined the document with the careful attention of a man whose professional reputation depended on such scrutiny. After several minutes, he looked up with a troubled expression. The signature appears genuine, he admitted reluctantly, and there are 2 witnesses listed. Wills and B. Wills, confirmed Gerald, Ada and Beatrice, who do mending in the village. Aunt Noria often employed them for needlework. They witnessed her signature as required by law. Miss Reeve suddenly found her voice. Yes, she said, her tone carefully controlled. Mrs. Fielding did mention that she had been reconsidering her affairs. She spoke of keeping things in the family, as she put it. She was always so thoughtful about such matters. Her confirmation seemed to lend weight to Gerald's claim, though Miss Marple noticed that the companion's hands were trembling slightly as she spoke. Inspector Slack stepped forward with the authority of one determined to impose order on a confusing situation. Right then, he said briskly, we've got 2 wills, both claiming to be genuine. This is a matter for the courts to sort out. I'll have to seal both documents pending proper investigation. He produced 2 official envelopes and carefully secured each will, though not before Miss Marple had managed to observe certain details that struck her as curious. The newer will's green ribbon appeared to be tied in an unusual manner. The tails were reversed from the traditional legal style, suggesting it had been tied by someone unfamiliar with such conventions. Moreover, she detected a faint but distinct odor emanating from the document's second page, reminiscent of the spirit. Duplicators used in schools. As the afternoon wore on and the various formalities were attended to, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the morning's developments. 2 wills, each apparently genuine, each telling a completely different story about Mrs. Fielding's final wishes. In her long experience, she had learned that when 2 stories contradicted each other so completely, the truth was usually to be found in examining not what was said, but what was carefully left unsaid. The April afternoon was drawing to a close as the assembled company finally began to disperse, leaving behind them a mystery that would require considerably more than legal expertise to unravel. The following morning brought with it a pale sun that struggled to penetrate the lingering mist, though the air held the promise of better weather to come. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night pondering the curious matter of Mrs. Fielding's 2 wills, decided that a visit to Rosemary might prove illuminating. There were, she felt, certain small questions that deserved attention before they were forgotten in the larger drama of legal proceedings. She arrived at the villa shortly after 10 o'clock, armed with a small basket containing a jar of her homemade quince jelly and the sort of gentle determination that had served her well in previous investigations into the more puzzling aspects of village life. Miss Alma Reeve admitted her with a weary courtesy of one who had spent the night wrestling with unprecedented complications. The companion's gray hair was less perfectly arranged than usual, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless hours. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a wan smile. "How thoughtful of you to call. Please do come in. I was just tidying Mrs. Fielding's papers. Such a sad task, but it must be done." The morning room appeared much as it had the day before, though the absence of Mrs. Fielding's commanding presence seemed to have left the space somehow diminished. The mahogany desk by the window still held its neat arrangement of correspondence, and Miss Marple's eyes were drawn once again to the stack of green legal ribbon and the box of red wafer seals that had caught her attention yesterday. "Such a terrible business about the wills," Miss Reeve continued, settling into one of the horsehair chairs with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her being. "Poor Mr. Gerald is quite distressed naturally. He never expected to inherit anything. Mrs. Fielding had always spoken so highly of her charitable work." Miss Marple murmured appropriate sympathy, while privately noting that Miss Reeve's distress seemed less focused on the competing wills than on some deeper anxiety that she was struggling to conceal. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if I might take a closer look at Mrs. Fielding's desk. I remember her showing me her writing supplies once, and I was rather impressed by her organization. Perhaps it would be appropriate to mention it in the memorial service." Miss Reeve looked momentarily uncertain, then nodded with the resigned air of one who had lost the energy to object to anything. "Of course," she said. Mrs. Fielding was indeed most methodical about her correspondence. She kept everything just so. Miss Marple approached the desk with the careful attention of a naturalist observing a particularly interesting specimen. The green ribbon lay precisely where it had been yesterday, still bearing that light coating of dust that suggested long disuse. She opened the drawer that Miss Reeve indicated and found it to contain the usual accessories of an active correspondent. More writing paper, envelopes, sealing wax, and a full spool of the same green legal ribbon. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, examining the spool with genuine interest. "This appears to be completely unused. I should have thought Mrs. Fielding would have had occasion to use such things regularly." Miss Reeve moved closer, her manner becoming slightly more animated as she warmed to the subject of her late employer's habits. "Oh, but she did," she said earnestly, "though not this particular ribbon, I think. The newer will, the one Mr. Gerald brought yesterday, had already been sent from town, you see. Mrs. Fielding received it by post just last month, all properly tied and sealed. She was quite particular about such things being done correctly." This information struck Miss Marple as rather odd. In her experience, wills were not typically mailed to their beneficiaries like ordinary correspondence. "From town?" she inquired. "Delicately. Yes, from Mr. Gerald's London solicitors, I believe. Mrs. Fielding mentioned that she'd consulted them as a matter of convenience. Mr. Gerald had recommended them, and since he was handling some business matters for her, it seemed sensible." Gerald Fielding, who had arrived at that moment and overheard the last part of this conversation, nodded earnestly from the doorway. "Indeed," he said, entering the room with the easy confidence of one now comfortable in his role as heir. "Poor Aunt Noria found it difficult to travel to Mr. Boyce's offices in her condition, and my London firm was happy to accommodate her. They have considerable experience with elderly clients who prefer to conduct their affairs at home." Miss Marple found this explanation entirely reasonable, yet something about the entire arrangement continued to puzzle her. She moved casually toward the wastebasket beside the desk, as though merely shifting position, and glanced down at its contents with the idle curiosity of one who notices such things without particular purpose. Among the usual detritus of correspondence, blotting paper, envelope corners, ink-stained scraps, she spotted something that made her pulse quicken with interest. It was a tiny curl of green thread, no larger than a child's fingernail, with what appeared to be a clean, squared-off end where it had been cut with scissors. "My goodness," she said, bending down as though to retrieve a dropped handkerchief. "I do believe I've dropped something." In the brief moment it took her to straighten up, she managed to secure the small green curl, palming it with the dexterity of a practiced conjurer. A quick examination revealed that, unlike the factory-cut ends of proper legal ribbon, which were always slanted for professional appearance, This piece had been cut straight across with domestic scissors. "Nothing important, I hope?" Gerald inquired politely. "Oh, no." Merely a thread from my knitting," Miss Marple replied with a sort of innocent smile that had served her well in similar circumstances. "I do seem to leave bits of wool wherever I go." As the conversation continued, Miss Marple found herself studying Gerald Fielding with renewed interest. He was certainly everything one would expect of a successful man of finance. Well-dressed, articulate, and possessed of that particular confidence that comes from a life spent in comfortable circumstances. Yet there was something in his manner, a watchfulness behind the urbane facade, that suggested a man who was carefully monitoring the effect of his words on his audience. Miss Reeve, meanwhile, continued to exhibit that curious mixture of grief and anxiety that Miss Marple had noted earlier. When Gerald mentioned the London solicitors, the companion's hands had tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap, and she'd glanced quickly toward the desk, as though some memory had suddenly troubled her. "The arrangements were all handled so efficiently," Miss Reeve said, her voice carefully controlled. "Mrs. Fielding was most grateful for the consideration shown to her circumstances. She often spoke of how thoughtful Mr. Gerald was in managing such difficult matters." Gerald accepted this praise with becoming modesty, though Miss Marple detected a certain satisfaction in his manner that seemed to go beyond mere filial duty. As the morning progressed and the conversation turned to funeral arrangements and the practical matters that death inevitably brings, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the small discrepancies that had begun to accumulate. The unused ribbon spool in the drawer, the clumsily cut thread in the wastebasket, the convenient arrangement with London solicitors, and the curious behavior of both Gerald and Miss Reeve, all suggested a picture that was considerably more complex than it initially appeared. By the time she took her leave, promising to return the following day with some flowers from her garden, Miss Marple had reached the conclusion that Mrs. Fielding's 2 wills represented only the beginning of what promised to be a most instructive puzzle. In her long experience with the more puzzling aspects of human nature, she had learned that the smallest details were often the most revealing, and the tiny green thread now safely tucked away in her handbag suggested that someone in this affair had been considerably less careful than they imagined. The pale April sun was finally beginning to assert itself as she walked back through the village, and Miss Marple reflected that spring, like truth, had a way of emerging, despite the most determined efforts to keep it buried. Miss Marple was awakened the following morning by the insistent ringing of her telephone, a modern convenience she had never entirely trusted, but which had proven its worth on occasions such as this. The caller was Mrs. Clement, and the agitation in her voice was immediately apparent, even through the mechanical distortion of the device. "Jane, dear, you must come at once," Mrs. Clement said without preamble. "There's been a terrible accident at Mr. Boyce's offices. The poor man has had a dreadful fall." Miss Marple was dressed and walking briskly toward the solicitor's offices. Within a quarter of an hour, her mind already turning over the disturbing implications of this news. In her experience, accidents had a way of occurring at the most inconvenient moments, particularly when important matters hung in the balance. The offices of Boyce and Associates occupied a narrow Georgian building on the High Street, its windows still gleaming with the brass nameplate that had announced the firm's presence for more than 40 years. A small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by the arrival of Dr. Haydock's motor car and the unmistakable presence of officialdom that surrounded any unexpected calamity. Inspector Slack emerged from the building as Miss Marple approached, his expression grim, but satisfied in the manner of one who had reached a swift and decisive conclusion. "Tragic accident," he announced to the assembled onlookers. "Mr. Boyce fell from a ladder in his deed room early this morning. Fractured skull, I'm afraid. Dr. Haydock says he would have died instantly." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the composure of one accustomed to life's more dramatic reversals, though she noted with interest that Inspector Slack seemed remarkably certain about the accidental nature of Mr. Boyce's death. "How very dreadful," she murmured. Was he alone when it happened? Miss Trent found him when she arrived to open the office, Slack replied. Poor woman's in quite a state, as you'd expect. Seems Mr. Boyce had come in early to attend to some urgent business. Probably something to do with Mrs. Fielding's estate, given the complications that have arisen. Miss Marple requested permission to offer her condolences to Miss Trent, and Inspector Slack, perhaps recognizing her as a harmless elderly lady with appropriate social connections, granted her access to the building. The deed room occupied the back portion of the ground floor, a cramped chamber lined floor to ceiling with metal filing cabinets and deed boxes. A tall wooden ladder of the type used in libraries provided access to the uppermost shelves. At its base lay a heavy tin box, its corners dented from impact with the stone floor. Miss Trent sat in the outer office, her face pale as parchment, and her hands shaking as she attempted to organize the papers on her desk. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her eyes red with tears that seemed to spring from something deeper than mere shock. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How kind of you to come. Such a terrible, terrible accident." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently, settling into the chair beside Miss Trent's desk. "You must have had a dreadful shock, finding him like that." Miss Trent nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that bore the initials MT in careful blue embroidery. "I arrived at 8, as always," she said. Mr. Boyce's hat and coat were already hanging in the hall, which surprised me. He rarely came in before 9. When I called out, there was no answer, so I went to look for him. She shuddered at the memory, and Miss Marple made appropriate sounds of sympathy, while privately noting that Miss Trent seemed more distressed than simple shock would account for. "The ladder was lying across him," Miss Trent continued, "and that heavy deed box had fallen on top. Inspector Slack says the rung must have been slippery from the damp weather. Such an unfortunate accident." Miss Marple glanced toward the deed room, where Inspector Slack could be heard making his final observations. Something about Miss Trent's precise recitation of the facts struck her as rehearsed, though she was careful not to let this suspicion show in her manner. "I wonder," she said delicately, "if I might pay my respects. Mr. Boyce was such a pillar of our community." Miss Trent hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I suppose it would be proper," she said, "though it's rather disturbing." Miss Marple made her way to the deed room with the careful steps of one mindful of the solemnity of the occasion. Inspector Slack was examining the fallen ladder with the thoroughness of a man determined to leave no detail unrecorded. "Terrible thing," he said, not looking up from his investigation. "The third rung from the top. You can see where it's been polished smooth. Must have been like ice under his feet." Miss Marple approached the ladder and examined the rung in question with the innocent curiosity of one unfamiliar with such technical matters. The wood was indeed smooth and gleaming, but not with the dull patina of age and use. Instead, it bore the distinctive luster of beeswax applied so recently that her fingertip detected a faint tackiness in the polish. More interesting still was a tiny thread of linen caught in a splinter on the ladder's side rail, the sort of thread used for heavy mending and embroidery work. "How very strange," she murmured, ostensibly to herself, but loud enough for Inspector Slack to hear. "This polish seems remarkably fresh for such an old ladder." Slack glanced up with the impatient expression of one whose conclusions had been challenged by amateur observation. "Nothing strange about it," he said briskly. "Miss Trent's a conscientious woman. Probably polishes the office furniture regular. Like natural thing for a tidy person to do." Miss Marple accepted this explanation with deference due to official authority, though she privately noted that beeswax was an unusual choice for office furniture, being more commonly used by those who worked with needle and thread to prevent tangling. As she prepared to leave the deed room, her attention was caught by the open safe in the corner, its heavy door standing ajar to reveal neat stacks of documents and deed boxes. Inspector Slack noticed her glance and nodded with satisfaction. "Nothing disturbed in there," he said. "Safe wasn't even properly closed. Mr. Boyce must have been working late last night and didn't bother to secure it. The original 1938 will is right where it should be. Rules out any question of theft or tampering." This information struck Miss Marple as significant, though she was careful not to show her interest too clearly. A solicitor of Mr. Boyce's experience and reputation would hardly leave his safe open overnight, particularly with important documents inside. The carelessness suggested either great preoccupation or great haste, neither of which seemed characteristic of the methodical man she'd known. As she made her farewells and walked back through the village, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient timing of Mr. Boyce's accident. The elderly solicitor had been in good health and excellent spirits only yesterday, and his lifelong familiarity with that latter made a simple slip seem improbable. The fresh beeswax, the linen thread, and the open safe all suggested a story, considerably more complex than Inspector Slack was prepared to consider. By the time she reached her own front gate, Miss Marple had reached the uncomfortable conclusion that Mr. Peril Boyce had not died by accident, and that his death was intimately connected with the puzzle of Mrs. Fielding's 2 wills. Someone had wanted to silence him before he could voice whatever suspicions had brought him to his office so early that morning. The question that remained was which of the interested parties had possessed both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to arrange such a carefully constructed accident. The April morning had turned bright and cheerful, but Miss Marple found that the sunshine seemed somehow inappropriate to the dark turn that events had taken. The afternoon brought with it one of those crystalline moments of clarity that sometimes follow periods of confusion, when disparate facts suddenly arrange themselves into patterns that demand investigation. Miss Marple, having spent the better part of the morning in contemplation of Mr. Boyce's unfortunate demise, found her thoughts turning to the matter of the witnesses named on Gerald Fielding's will, A. Wills and B. Wills. Such convenient names for witnesses, she reflected, particularly when they belonged to sisters well known throughout the village for their skill with needle and thread. Ada and Beatrice Wills had been mending clothes and household linens for the better families of St. Mary Mead for more than 20 years, and their cottage on Vicarage Lane was a familiar destination for anyone requiring expert needlework. It was, Miss Marple decided, high time she paid them a visit. The Wills' cottage stood behind a neat garden where spring onions and early lettuce grew in orderly rows. The hall presented that air of modest prosperity that comes from honest work performed with skill and dedication. The front door was opened by Beatrice, the elder of the 2 sisters, a woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned severely back, and the sort of sharp, intelligent eyes that missed very little of what went on around her. "Miss Marple," Beatrice said with obvious pleasure, "how lovely to see you. Do come in. Ada and I were just having our tea." The cottage interior was exactly what one would expect from 2 women who earned their living through precision and attention to detail. Every surface gleamed with careful polishing, and the sitting room bore testament to their professional skills in the form of delicate antimacassars and carefully mended chair covers that showed no trace of their original damage. Ada, the younger sister, rose from her chair by the fire with some difficulty. She was a thin, pale woman who moved with the careful deliberation of one still recovering from illness, and Miss Marple noted that her breathing seemed somewhat labored. "Sister's just getting over her pneumonia," Beatrice explained, settling Miss Marple into the best chair and bustling about with the tea things. "Gave us quite a fright, didn't you, Ada? 3 weeks in the infirmary, and the doctor said it was touch and go for a while." Miss Marple expressed appropriate concern for Ada's health, while privately calculating dates with the precision of a mathematician. 3 weeks in the infirmary would place Ada's illness squarely at the time when Gerald's will had allegedly been witnessed. "Such a worry it must have been," she said sympathetically. "When exactly were you taken ill, my dear?" Ada settled back into her chair with a grateful sigh. "March 20th it was, Miss Marple. I remember because it was the day after the spring equinox. and I'd been planning to start the spring cleaning. Woke up that morning feeling poorly, and by evening I could barely breathe. Dr. Haydock said I was lucky Beatrice got me to the infirmary, when she did. "And you were there until quite recently?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Until this past Monday," Ada confirmed, 2 days after poor Mrs. Fielding passed away. "I was sorry to miss paying my respects. She was always very kind to us." "Was Mrs. Fielding?" Beatrice nodded enthusiastically as she poured the tea. "Oh, yes. A lovely lady. Always so particular about her needlework being done properly. Why, just a few months ago, she had us over to witness her signature on some sort of receipt or document. Very proper about it. She wanted everything done just so." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "A receipt, you say?" "Something of the sort," Beatrice replied, settling back with her own tea. "She was very grateful to someone, a charity organization, I believe, and wanted to acknowledge their kindness properly. Asked us both to witness her signature, though. It seemed a bit formal for a simple thank you note." "Both of you?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Oh, yes. She was most insistent that we both sign. Said it was important that everything be done correctly with proper witnesses. We were happy to oblige, of course. Such a small thing to do for a lady who'd been so good to us over the years." Ada leaned forward slightly, her pale face earnest. "Though I must say I was surprised when that nice Mr. Gerald mentioned yesterday that I'd witnessed something for his aunt recently. My memory's not been quite right since the pneumonia, but I'm certain I haven't been to Rosemary since before Christmas." This statement fell into the quiet sitting room like a stone dropped into still water. Beatrice looked puzzled, while Miss Marple felt that familiar stirring of interest that accompanied the discovery of a significant discrepancy. "Mr. Gerald mentioned that you had witnessed something?" she inquired with carefully maintained casualness. "Yes, when he stopped by yesterday evening to express his condolences," Ada replied. "He said he hoped I was feeling better after witnessing his aunt's will. Such a considerate young man, but I had to tell him there must be some mistake. I haven't put pen to paper for anything official since before my illness." Beatrice frowned thoughtfully. "That is odd. Perhaps there's been some confusion with the dates. You know how these legal matters can be." Miss Marple nodded agreement while privately noting that legal documents were typically rather precise about such details. A will that named Ada Wills as a witness on a date when she was lying gravely ill in the infirmary represented a discrepancy that went well beyond simple confusion. "I don't suppose," she said delicately, "you recall exactly what it was you witnessed for Mrs. Fielding those months ago?" Beatrice pursed her lips in concentration. "It was sometime in late autumn, I believe. Mrs. Fielding had a sign at the bottom of a paper. She covered the rest with a cloth, said it was private business, but she needed proper witnesses. We signed A. Wills and B. Wills, as she requested. She was very particular about the signatures being clear and proper." "And you're quite certain about the timing?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Oh, yes," Beatrice said firmly. "It was definitely before Ada took ill. We walked home together afterwards, and I remember thinking how fortunate we were that the weather was still mild enough for such outings." Ada nodded weakly from her chair. "I may not remember much from these past weeks, but I'm certain I haven't been anywhere near Rosemary since my illness began. The idea that I witnessed anything in April is quite impossible." Miss Marple finished her tea while pondering this revelation. If Ada Wills had been in the infirmary during the time when Gerald's will was allegedly witnessed, then her signature on that document was either forged or copied from some earlier occasion. The latter possibility seemed more likely, given Beatrice's account of witnessing something for Mrs. Fielding months ago. As she prepared to take her leave, thanking the sisters for their hospitality and expressing hopes for Ada's continued recovery, Miss Marple reflected on the curious phrase that had been echoing in her mind since the beginning of this affair. 2 wills, she murmured to herself as she walked back through the village. Indeed, there are 2 wills, but only 1 pen that could have signed that document. The implications of this discovery were considerable, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to a thorough examination of the newer will with fresh eyes. If Ada Wills could not possibly have witnessed Mrs. Fielding's signature in April, then someone had taken considerable trouble to create the appearance of proper legal procedure, while cutting several corners in the process. The spring evening was drawing in as she reached her own cottage, and Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair by the window, with the satisfaction of one who had made significant progress toward unraveling a complex puzzle. Tomorrow, she decided, would be an excellent time to examine that will more closely, preferably in good light, and with the sort of careful attention that such documents deserved. Chapter 6. Watermark in Tea. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with a sort of crisp April sunshine that makes even the most serious matters seem somehow manageable. Miss Marple, having spent a productive evening in contemplation of the various threads that were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern, decided that the time had come for a more detailed examination of the physical evidence. She presented herself at Rosemary shortly after breakfast, armed with a plausible excuse and a small but determined plan. Miss Alma Reeve, looking somewhat more composed than she had in recent days, admitted her with the weary courtesy of one who'd grown accustomed to a steady stream of visitors offering condolences and assistance. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a wan smile, "how good of you to continue calling. I confess these past few days have been rather overwhelming." The morning room seemed to have acquired an air of suspended animation, as though waiting for some resolution to the various complications that had arisen since Mrs. Fielding's death. Gerald was nowhere to be seen, and Miss Marple gathered from Miss Reeve's manner that he had departed for London on business matters related to the estate. "I wondered," Miss Marple said with the diffident air of one making a modest request, "if I might borrow a copy of the newer will. The Hospital Fund Committee has asked me to prepare a brief statement about Mrs. Fielding's charitable intentions, and I should like to ensure that the wording is precise." Miss Reeve looked momentarily uncertain, then nodded with the resigned air of one who had lost the energy to object to reasonable requests. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she said. "Inspector Slack did say that the document would eventually become public record anyway. Let me fetch it from the desk." She retrieved the envelope containing Gerald's will and handed it to Miss Marple with careful formality. "Perhaps you could return it this afternoon. Mr. Gerald was most particular that it should be kept safe." Miss Marple assured her that she would treat the document with appropriate care and made her departure with the precious envelope tucked securely in her handbag. Once safely back in her own cottage, she settled herself at the kitchen table with the sort of methodical preparation that had served her well in previous investigations. The will itself appeared at first glance to be everything one would expect of a proper legal document. The paper was of good quality. The typing was neat and professional, and Mrs. Fielding's bold signature appeared genuine. Yet something about the overall presentation continued to trouble her in ways she could not immediately define. It was then that she remembered a technique she had observed years earlier when her late father had been examining some questionable banknotes in his capacity as a bank manager. "Paper," he had explained, "often reveals its secrets when examined in the proper light." Miss Marple fetched her finest bone china teacup, one that was thin enough to be nearly transparent, and filled it with a small amount of tea. Holding the first page of the will against the cup and positioning both near the window, she was rewarded with a clear view of the paper's watermark. What she saw made her sit back in her chair with considerable satisfaction. The watermark clearly showed the date 1947, 4 years after the will's purported date of April 1941. She repeated the examination with the second page and found something even more interesting. Not only did this page bear the same anachronistic watermark, but it also gave off that faint aniline smell she had noticed before, the distinctive odor of spirit-duplicating ink used in schools and small offices. The first page, by contrast, bore no such chemical taint, suggesting that it had not been subjected to the same duplicating process. Miss Marple set down the teacup and regarded the will with the satisfaction of one who had just confirmed a significant suspicion. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create this document, but they had made several crucial errors in the process. She turned her attention to the attestation clause, the formal legal language that accompanied the witnesses' signatures. Here, too, she found something that struck her as odd. The phrasing was perfectly correct, almost textbook in its precision. Yet, in her memory of Mr. Boyce's other wills, which she had occasionally seen in connection with various charitable bequests, she recalled that the elderly solicitor had always used slightly archaic language, including words like aforesaid, that modern legal practice had largely abandoned. This will, by contrast, employed the clean, modern phrasing that might be found in a contemporary legal handbook. It was too perfect, too precisely worded for a document allegedly drawn up by a traditionalist like Mr. Boyce. Miss Marple carefully returned the will to its envelope and sat back to consider the implications of her discoveries. The evidence was mounting that Gerald's will was not merely suspicious, but demonstrably fraudulent. The watermark proved that at least part of the document had been created years after its supposed date. The aniline smell suggested the use of duplicating equipment, and the legal phrasing indicated a hand other than Mr. Boyce's in its preparation. Yet questions remained. If the will was forged, how had the forgers obtained Mrs. Fielding's genuine signature, and why had they chosen to use spirit-duplicating techniques when more sophisticated methods were available? The answer to the first question came to her with a sudden clarity that often accompanies a flash of insight. Gerald had mentioned that his aunt had signed various charity appeals and acknowledgments over the years. It would have been simple enough for someone with access to her correspondence to obtain a genuine signature on a blank piece of paper, claiming it was for some worthy cause. The second question suggested amateurs at work, people familiar with office equipment but not with professional forgery techniques. Spirit duplicators were common in small businesses and organizations, but they left telltale traces that a skilled forger would have avoided. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at her garden, where the spring flowers were beginning to show their first tentative blooms. The pattern was becoming clearer, but there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. Most importantly, she needed to understand the exact mechanism by which the forgery had been accomplished, and identify all the participants in the scheme. One thing was certain: Mr. Boyce's death was no accident. The elderly solicitor must have begun to suspect the truth about the newer will, and someone had acted swiftly to silence him before he could voice his concerns. As she prepared to return the document to Rosemary, Miss Marple reflected that the truth, like the spring sunshine now flooding her kitchen, had a way of illuminating even the most carefully concealed deceptions. The forgers had been clever, but not quite clever enough to avoid the sort of detailed scrutiny that suspicious circumstances inevitably attracted. The afternoon was still young, and there remained much work to be done before the full truth could be revealed. But Miss Marple felt confident that the essential facts were now within her grasp, and that justice for both Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Boyce was finally within reach. The idea of keeping watch at Rosemary had come to Miss Marple during the quiet hours of the evening, when the day's discoveries had settled into her mind, with the persistence of seeds awaiting the right conditions to sprout. There was something about the entire affair that suggested unfinished business, loose ends that someone might feel compelled to tidy up once darkness provided adequate cover. She had mentioned her concerns to Sergeant Lake, a sensible young man who had learned to take Miss Marple's intuition seriously after several previous occasions, when her observations had proven remarkably prescient. Lake had agreed to position himself discreetly in the shrubbery behind Rosemary, while Miss Marple would maintain her vigil from the lane, concealed by the convenient shadow of the old oak tree that stood opposite the villa's front gate. The night was clear and mild, with a three-quarter moon providing enough light to distinguish shapes and movements without being so bright as to eliminate the concealing shadows. Miss Marple had equipped herself with a warm shawl, a thermos of tea, and the sort of patient determination that had served her well in previous nocturnal observations. The village settled into its customary nighttime quiet by 10, with only the occasional sound of a late motorist or the distant bark of a dog to disturb the peace. Rosemary itself showed no lights, save for the dim glow of a single window on the ground floor, where Miss Reeve presumably kept watch over her. Late employer's effects. It was shortly before midnight when Miss Marple's patience was rewarded. A slight figure emerged from the direction of the high street, moving with the careful stealth of one who wished to avoid observation. Even in the uncertain moonlight, there was something familiar about the way the figure carried itself, a particular rigidity of posture that Miss Marple recognized. The figure paused at Rosemary's front gate, glanced quickly up and down the lane, then moved toward the side entrance that led to the kitchen garden. Miss Marple rose quietly from her position and signaled to Sergeant Lake, who emerged from the shadows with the quiet efficiency of a professional. They watched as the intruder produced what appeared to be a key and let herself into the villa with practiced ease. A few moments later, a faint light appeared in the morning room window. Not the steady glow of electric illumination, but the wavering beam of a torch or dark lantern. "Shall we, miss?" whispered Sergeant Lake, and Miss Marple nodded her agreement. They approached the house with the careful steps of experienced conspirators. Lake led the way with the quiet confidence of one trained in such matters. The side door stood slightly ajar, and they could hear the soft sounds of someone moving about in the morning room with obvious familiarity with the layout. Lake pushed. The door opened gently, and they stepped into the darkened hallway. The sounds from the morning room were clearer now, the soft rustle of papers and the quiet scrape of furniture being moved. "Now," Lake whispered, and they stepped quickly into the lighted room. Miss Maud Trent spun around with a gasp of terror, her pale face ghostly in the torchlight. In her hands, she held a slim parcel wrapped in brown paper, and scattered on Mrs. Fielding's desk were several items that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. A short length of green legal ribbon, a small packet of red wafer seals, and a curious implement that appeared to be a tiny pin vice-fitted with a needle-like bit. "Miss Trent," said Sergeant Lake with official authority, "I must ask you to explain your presence here at this hour." Miss Trent's composure crumbled entirely. The efficient clerk who had managed Mr. Boyce's office with such precision dissolved into a trembling woman whose carefully controlled facade had finally shattered under the weight of accumulated guilt and fear. "I couldn't bear it," she sobbed, clutching the parcel to her chest like a shield. The way it was tied so slovenly, so unprofessional. Mr. Boyce would have been horrified to see legal documents presented in such a manner. Miss Marple approached the desk and examined the scattered items with the careful attention of one who understood their significance. The green ribbon was of the same type she had observed before, but this piece showed the telltale signs of amateur handling. The wafer seals were identical to those she had seen in Mrs. Fielding's desk, and the tiny pin vise was exactly the sort of tool that might be used to create the impression of an official seal. "You came to restore proper tying," Miss Marple said. "Gently. For decorum's sake," Miss Trent nodded miserably. "Mr. Gerald asked me as a favor to ensure that the will was properly presented for probate. He said it was important that everything looked correct and professional. I couldn't refuse. He had been so kind, so understanding about my feelings." Sergeant Lake stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to such revelations. "Miss Trent, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. Do you wish to tell us about your involvement in this matter?" The floodgates opened then, and Miss Trent's carefully guarded secrets poured forth with the force of water released from a dam. She spoke of Gerald's charm, his promises of marriage once the estate was settled, his gradual manipulation of her, professional expertise for purposes she had only gradually come to understand. He brought the first page from London, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Said his aunt had signed it for a charity appeal, but that the appeal had been cancelled and the paper could be reused. I typed the will on it. He dictated the terms. It seemed harmless enough at first. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance. With Sergeant Lake, the picture was becoming clearer, but there were still crucial details to be uncovered. And the witnesses? She prompted gently. Gerald suggested the Will sisters. He said it was clever. 2 wills witnessing a will. I copied Beatrice's signature from a receipt Mrs. Fielding had shown me months earlier. The other signature, she trailed off, her face flushing with shame. You used the spirit duplicator at the office, Miss Marple said with certainty. Miss Trent nodded miserably. I had a sample of handwriting from some mending work Ada had done. The duplicator made it possible to transfer the signature to the will. I thought I was being so clever, but I see now how wrong it all was. As the full confession unfolded, Miss Marple found herself feeling a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Pity for the lonely woman who had been manipulated by a charming scoundrel, and satisfaction that the truth was finally emerging from the web of deception that had surrounded Mrs. Fielding's death. But one crucial question remained. What exactly had happened to Mr. Boyce? And how much did Miss Trent know about the circumstances of his death? The answer to that question, Miss Marple suspected, would require further investigation and perhaps a more detailed conversation with someone who had not yet revealed the full extent of their involvement in this increasingly complex affair. Chapter 8. Burnt Carbon. The following morning found Miss Marple once again at the offices of Boyce & Associates, this time in the company of Inspector Slack, who had finally been persuaded that Miss Trent's midnight activities warranted a more thorough examination of the scene where Mr. Boyce had met his unfortunate end. The inspector's manner suggested a man who was beginning to suspect that his initial conclusions might have been somewhat hasty. Right then, Slack announced as they entered the building. Let's have another look at this deed room. Miss Trent's confession about the will forgery put a different complexion on things, I'll admit. Miss Marple followed him into the cramped chamber where Mr. Boyce had spent his final moments, her attention immediately drawn to details that had seemed insignificant during her previous visit. The morning light streaming through the high window illuminated corners and crevices that had been shadowed before. I wonder, she said delicately, if we might examine the fireplace. The small grate in the corner of the deed room appeared to have been recently used, despite the mild April weather that would hardly have required additional heating. Inspector Slack crouched down and peered into the ashes with the thoroughness of one determined not to overlook anything significant this time. Interesting, he muttered, poking at the gray debris with a poker. Looks like someone's been burning papers. Miss Marple joined him in examining the remains, her experienced eye picking out details that spoke of hasty destruction rather than routine disposal. Among the gray ash were black specks that could only be the remnants of carbon paper. And in one corner lay a half-used scrap of typewriter ribbon that had somehow escaped complete incineration. Carbon paper and typewriter ribbon, she observed. Curious things to burn in a legal office where such materials would normally be disposed of through routine channels. Inspector Slack carefully extracted the partially burned ribbon with his penknife, holding it up to the light for examination. Though damaged by fire, enough remained to show that it had been used recently, and intensively. Someone was trying to hide evidence of typing, he said, with the satisfaction of one whose detective instincts were finally being properly employed. Question is, what were they typing, and why did they need to destroy the evidence? Miss Marple turned her attention to Mr. Boyce's desk, which occupied the center of the main office. The leather-topped surface bore the usual accumulation of legal papers and correspondence, but something about the blotter caught her eye. She approached it with the careful attention of one who had learned to read significance in the smallest details. The blotter, like many of its kind, had absorbed ink and impressions from countless documents over the years, creating a palimpsest of legal business that spoke of decades of careful work. But among the faded impressions of routine correspondence, Miss Marple detected something that made her pulse quicken with interest. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should see this." She indicated a section of the blotter where recent impressions were clearly visible in mirror image, as though someone had been writing or typing with considerable pressure. The words, though reversed, were unmistakably legible to anyone with experience in reading such impressions. "Will of Mrs. H. Fielding?" Inspector Slack read slowly, tilting his head to decipher the backward text. And below that, something about bequests to Gerald Fielding. Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "It appears that someone used this desk to prepare a draft of the forged will. The pressure of the typing has left a clear impression on the blotter." The implications were significant. If someone had prepared the forged will in Mr. Boyce's office, it suggested either that the elderly solicitor had been involved in the deception or that someone with access to his office had been using his facilities for fraudulent purposes. Inspector Slack moved to Miss Trent's desk, which occupied a corner of the outer office. His search of the drawers revealed the usual accumulation of office supplies and personal effects. But in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a collection of legal forms, he discovered something that brought the investigation into sharp focus. Well, he said, holding up a sheet of paper covered with repeated signatures. "What have we here?" Miss Marple examined the practice sheet with the attention it deserved. Row after row of Honoria Fielding marched across the page in increasingly confident copperplate, showing the progression from hesitant imitation to fluent forgery. The handwriting was unmistakably Miss Trent's, but the signatures themselves bore a remarkable resemblance to Mrs. Fielding's bold style. "She was practicing," Miss Marple observed, "though I suspect this was not for the will itself, but for some other purpose." Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly grim as the full scope of the deception became clear. "Miss Trent's been busy, hasn't she? Forging signatures, burning evidence, and Lord knows what else." As they continued their examination of the office, Miss Marple found herself reconstructing the sequence of events that had led to Mr. Boyce's death. The elderly solicitor had clearly begun to suspect something about the newer will, perhaps the unusual legal phrasing or the convenient timing of its appearance. His decision to examine the document more closely had sealed his fate. "I believe," she said thoughtfully, "that Mr. Boyce discovered something about the will that aroused his suspicions. Perhaps he noticed that the wafer seal had been impressed over a faint crease in the paper, something that would never happen in proper legal practice, where documents are sealed before folding." Inspector Slack looked up from his examination of the burnt papers. "You think he was getting too close to the truth?" "I think he was beginning to ask the sort of questions that someone couldn't afford to have answered," Miss Marple replied. "And when that happens, people sometimes take desperate measures to protect themselves." The morning's work had yielded a wealth of evidence, but Miss Marple sensed that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Miss Trent's confession had revealed the mechanism of the forgery, but questions remained about the full extent of the conspiracy and the exact circumstances of Mr. Boyce's death. As they prepared to leave the office, Miss Marple reflected that the truth, like the carbon impressions on the blotter, had a way of leaving permanent traces despite all efforts to erase it. The forgers had been careful, but not careful enough to eliminate every piece of evidence that pointed to their guilt. The afternoon promised further revelations, and Miss Marple looked forward to the moment when all the scattered pieces of this complex puzzle would finally fall into place, revealing the full truth about Mrs. Fielding's two wills and the tragic consequences that had followed their creation. The drawing room at Rosemary had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating the assembled company with the sort of dramatic intensity that seemed entirely appropriate to the occasion. Inspector Slack had requested the presence of all the principal parties in what he termed a final review of the evidence. Though Miss Marple suspected that the inspector was hoping she would provide the clarity that had thus far eluded his official investigation. Gerald Fielding sat in the largest chair, his urbane composure showing the first signs of strain as the weight of accumulating evidence began to press upon him. Miss Alma Reeve occupied her usual position near the window, her hands busy with a piece of mending that seemed to provide her with some measure of comfort in these trying circumstances. Miss Maud Trent, pale and shaken from her night in custody, perched on the edge of a straight-backed chair with the air of one who expected the worst and was determined to face it with whatever dignity remained to her. Lady Bantry had positioned herself near the fireplace with the authority of one accustomed to presiding over dramatic moments, while Dr. Haydock and the Clements had arranged themselves with the careful attention of witnesses to an important event. Inspector Slack stood with his back to the mantelpiece, his notebook at the ready, and his expression suggesting a man who was finally beginning to see his way clear through a complex tangle of deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from complete certainty about the facts she was about to present. "We have before us a puzzle that has taken several days to unravel, but which becomes quite clear once we examine the evidence with proper attention to detail." She moved to the mahogany desk where Mrs. Fielding had conducted her correspondence, her fingers touching the various objects that had told their story to anyone willing to listen carefully. The mystery began with 2 wills, each claiming to represent Mrs. Fielding's final wishes. But as we have discovered, only one of these documents was genuine, and the other was the product of considerable ingenuity and equally considerable carelessness. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but his expression remained carefully neutral as Miss Marple continued her exposition. "Let us begin with the ribbon," she said, picking up a length of green legal tape from the desk. The newer will was tied with what appeared to be proper legal ribbon, but the manner of tying revealed something significant to anyone familiar with such things. The bow was tied left-handed, with the tails reversed from the traditional legal style. "This might seem a trivial detail," she continued, "but it becomes important when we consider who among our company is left-handed." She looked directly at Miss Reeve, whose hands stilled in their mending work. "Miss Reeve is left-handed, as anyone who has watched her write or sew can easily observe. Yet Miss Trent, who has confessed to preparing the forged will, is right-handed. Someone else retied that ribbon after the document was completed." Inspector Slack made a note in his book, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain where this line of reasoning was leading. "The ribbon tails were also significant," Miss Marple continued. "They had been cut with scissors rather than showing the slanted factory ends typical of proper legal ribbon. I found a small piece of such ribbon in Mrs. Fielding's wastebasket, evidence that someone had cut a short length for use in the forgery, but had done so clumsily." She moved to the ladder that had been brought in from Mr. Boyce's office for demonstration purposes. Mr. Boyce's death was presented as an accident, but the evidence tells a different story. The ladder rung was smeared with beeswax, not furniture. Polish, but the specific type of wax used by seamstresses to prevent thread from tangling. Miss Reeve, who does constant mending work, would have such wax readily available. Miss Reeve's face had gone very pale, but she continued her needlework with mechanical precision. "More telling still," Miss Marple continued, "was the linen thread caught in the ladder's splinter. This was not ordinary sewing thread, but the heavy linen used for mending and embroidery, exactly the type that Miss Reeve uses in her work." She turned her attention to the matter of the witnesses, her voice taking on the patient tone of one explaining a complex problem to attentive students. The will listed A. Wills and B. Wills as witnesses, which seemed perfectly plausible, until we discovered that Ada Wills was in the infirmary with pneumonia on the date the will was allegedly witnessed. She could not possibly have signed anything, yet her signature appeared on the document. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. I can confirm that Ada Wills was under my care throughout that period. She was far too ill to leave the infirmary. The solution, Miss Marple continued, lay in the spirit duplicating process. Someone had copied Ada's signature from an earlier document, probably the receipt that Beatrice mentioned witnessing months ago. The aniline smell on the second page of the will, but not the first, indicated that only part of the document had been subjected to the duplicating process. She moved to examine the will itself, which lay open on the desk. The paper told its own story. The watermark showed 1947, yet the will was dated 1941. The paper stock was wrong for Mr. Boyce's practice. He always used county paper from Lowther's, but this sheet came from City Legal, Gerald's London firm. Gerald's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack as the weight of evidence accumulated against him. The attestation clause was another clue, Miss Marple continued. It was too perfectly phrased for Mr. Boyce, who always used slightly archaic language in his legal documents. This will employed modern boilerplate language that matched the style of contemporary London firms. She paused to let these revelations settle before delivering the final piece of the puzzle. But the most telling evidence was the wafer seal. Mr. Boyce always folded his documents before sealing them. It was an invariable habit of his practice. Yet this will showed a faint crease under the seal, indicating that it had been folded after sealing. Someone unfamiliar with Mr. Boyce's methods had made a crucial error. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with growing understanding. So how exactly was the forgery accomplished? Gerald obtained a genuine signature from his aunt, Miss Marple explained, probably for a charity appeal, as Miss Trent mentioned. Miss Trent then typed the fraudulent will onto this pre-signed page using Mr. Boyce's office equipment to give it authenticity. She copied the witnesses' signatures using the spirit duplicator, and Gerald arranged for the document to be properly ribbon-tied and sealed. But something went wrong, she continued. Mr. Boyce began to suspect the forgery when he examined the will more closely. He noticed the improper sealing, perhaps, or the unusual legal phrasing. When he visited Rosemary to make further inquiries, Miss Reeve realized that the entire scheme was about to unravel. All eyes turned to Miss Reeve, who had finally stopped, her mending, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of resigned defeat. She couldn't allow Mr. Boyce to expose the forgery, Miss Marple concluded gently, because her own complicity in opening Mrs. Fielding's correspondence and facilitating Gerald's access to the household would have been revealed. So she arranged his accident, using her mending wax to make the latter rung treacherous, and later retied the will's ribbon left-handed when she dusted at Rosemary. The very action that ultimately betrayed her involvement. The room fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy finally became clear to everyone present. Chapter 10. Probate Revealed. The silence that followed Miss Marple's explanation stretched for what seemed like minutes, though it was probably no more than a few seconds before Miss Alma Reeve finally spoke. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of complete defeat. I never meant for anyone to die, she said, her hands trembling as she set aside her mending. Mrs. Fielding was so good to me, gave me a home and purpose when I had nothing. When I realized what Gerald was planning, I should have stopped it. Then, Gerald Fielding rose from his chair with the sudden violence of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. This is preposterous, he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. You cannot seriously believe that Alma, a gentlewoman who wouldn't harm a fly, could have murdered poor Mr. Boyce? Inspector Slack stepped forward with the authority of his office. Mr. Fielding, I think you'd better sit down. Miss Marple hasn't finished. Miss Marple regarded Gerald with the sort of compassionate firmness she might have shown to a wayward child who had finally been caught in a serious misdeed. Gerald conceived the entire scheme, she continued, her voice maintaining its gentle but inexorable tone. He needed money. His financial circumstances were not as secure as they appeared. Mrs. Fielding's estate represented a solution to his problems, but he knew that her charitable inclinations made it unlikely she would change her will in his favor naturally. Moved to the window, gazing out at the garden, where spring flowers bloomed in cheerful defiance of the dark drama unfolding within the house. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. Gerald would obtain a genuine signature from his aunt, not difficult for someone she trusted and who had legitimate reasons to ask for such things. Miss Trent, besotted with Gerald and believing his promises of marriage, would use her professional skills to create a convincing will. Miss Trent buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The choice of witnesses was particularly clever, Miss Marple continued. The Will sisters provided perfect cover, 2 wills witnessing a will. As Gerald apparently told Miss Trent, the ambiguity was deliberate, allowing for confusion about which sister had actually witnessed what. She turned back to face the assembled company, her expression grave but determined. Miss Reeves' involvement began innocently enough. She had been quietly opening Mrs. Fielding's post, a common practice among companions, done with the best of intentions to spare an elderly lady from troublesome correspondence. Gerald took advantage of this access, persuading Alma to occasionally lend him small amounts from the household money for what he claimed were temporary business difficulties. Miss Reeve nodded miserably. He was always so charming, so grateful. He said it was just until his investments recovered. I never thought. When the forged will was created, Miss Marple continued, it was sent to Mrs. Fielding by post, as Gerald mentioned, but it never actually came from London solicitors. Gerald simply mailed it to his aunt from London during one of his business trips, creating the appearance of official correspondence. Miss Reeve, in her role as companion, naturally opened it and presented it to Mrs. Fielding as though it were a legitimate legal document. The picture was becoming increasingly clear, and Gerald's face had taken on the pallor of a man who realized his carefully constructed deceptions were crumbling beyond repair. Mrs. Fielding, trusting her nephew and her companion, accepted the document as genuine, Miss Marple said. She may have been puzzled by certain aspects of it, but Gerald was persuasive, and the document appeared official. The ribbon was tied clumsily by Miss Trent, but Miss Reeve retied it properly later, left-handed as was her habit. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. And Mr. Boyce's death? Miss Marple's expression grew particularly grave. Mr. Boyce began to suspect something was wrong when he examined the newer will more carefully. Perhaps it was the wafer seal impressed over the fold mark, or the modern legal phrasing that didn't match his usual style. Whatever aroused his suspicions, he decided to visit Rosemary the morning he died to make discreet inquiries. Miss Reeve looked up with eyes filled with tears. He was so kind, so gentle in his questions, but I could see he was beginning to piece things together. He asked about the ribbon, about who had access to Mrs. Fielding's correspondence. I knew it was only a matter of time before he discovered everything. So you took your mending wax with you when you brought him tea in the deed room, Miss Marple said with infinite gentleness. You applied it to the ladder rung, knowing that Mr. Boyce would need to use the ladder to retrieve documents from the upper shelves. It was a desperate act by a desperate woman. The confession came in broken sentences, punctuated by tears and the sort of anguish that comes from finally acknowledging the full weight of one's actions. I never meant to kill him, Miss Reeve sobbed. I thought perhaps he would just slip, perhaps twist an ankle or take a tumble that would discourage him from pursuing his inquiries. When I heard the crash, when I saw him lying there, I knew what I had done was unforgivable. Gerald made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his schemes. Even if what you say is true, you cannot prove any of it. It's all speculation, and circumstantial evidence. Miss Marple smiled with the sort of patience that had weathered many such protests over the years. "Oh, but we can prove it," she said quietly. "Ada Wills's hospital records confirm she couldn't have witnessed anything in April. The watermark proves the paper is wrong for the date. The aniline traces show the duplicating process. The blotter impression reveals where the draft was prepared. Miss Trent's signature practice sheets demonstrate the preparation that went into the forgery." Inspector Slack stepped forward with grim satisfaction. "Gerald Fielding, I arrest you on charges of conspiracy to defraud and forgery. Alma Reeve, I arrest you for the manslaughter of Mr. Boyce." As the handcuffs were applied and the formal cautions given, Miss Trent looked up through her tears at Gerald, her face showing the devastating realization that all her dreams of marriage and respectability had been nothing more than cruel manipulation. "I'll testify," she said quietly. "I'll tell them everything. It's the least I can do for poor Mr. Boyce and Mrs. Fielding." 2 hours later, as the police vehicles departed and the drama finally drew to its close, Lady Bantry settled back in her chair with a long breath. "Two wills indeed," she said, echoing the words that had begun this entire affair. Miss Marple folded a length of green ribbon with careful precision, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Two wills," she agreed, "and neither of them the widow's true testament. In village matters, dear Dolly, the paper tells you everything, provided you pour a little light through it, or in this case, a little tea." The April afternoon was drawing to a close, and with it the mystery that had begun with such promise of spring and ended with such bitter revelations. Mrs. Fielding's true will would stand. Her charitable intentions would be honored, and justice, however delayed, would finally be served. But for Miss Marple, settling into her favorite chair with her knitting as the evening light faded, there remained the satisfaction that comes from seeing truth triumph over deception, and the quiet knowledge that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces for those patient enough to find.